Hi everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be looking at a poem called The Show by Wilfred Owen, and if you haven't watched one of these videos before, I recommend that while you're watching you take some notes. I've got a note-taking template here which is called the Cornell note-taking style. They've got another video about how to do that, so if you type into YouTube Docky Smith Cornell note-taking, there's a how-to video on how to take notes in that way. But let's crack on then and have a look at the poem. So with all of the texts that I'm doing in this series, I'm thinking about how we can apply literary theory. And what I want to say before we get into that is that literary theory doesn't provide you with a checklist of things to spot in a text. You know, you don't have a checklist if you're doing feminism about, right, I need to look for a woman who's oppressed and a patriarchal figure who's oppressing her and the psychological impact of repression on women. You know, you don't have that kind of checklist. What literary theory is there for is to help open your eyes to some elements of the text that you might not already have noticed. It's there to inform your understanding, but you should always be led by the text, because a literary text is, as literary critics, is what we're interested in. So be led by the text and have the theory kind of in the background, bubbling away on the back burner. You're thinking about it, but you're not being led by the theory. So the theory that we're going to have in the background today is Marxism. And again, I've got a separate video on Marxism if you don't know anything about it. I'm going to assume that you do know something about it for today's video. Marxist critics in general look at how writers represent the class system. And in today's poem, I've put here a little reminder to myself, literary theory should be a torch, not a straitjacket, as in it's lighting the way, it's illuminating the text for us, but it's not a straitjacket that's going to entrap us in that checklist that I already mentioned. So if we're thinking about Marxism in relation to this show, what we need to know is that one of the contextual factors behind the outbreak of World War I was economic. Certainly from the perspective of Wilfred Owen and other writers of the time, when they were looking at why the war had started, they were thinking, well, actually, this is about land grabbing, this is about power, this is about attempting to assert political and economic dominance in Europe. World War I is very different to World War II. In World War II, it was much more about liberating people groups who were being oppressed by the Nazi regime, and it was about ensuring freedom for the rest of the world and stopping the Nazi regime in its tracks, whereas World War I was much more about individual countries battling together to try and gain power, at least from the perspective of the time. That's what they thought it was. So it could therefore be argued that many war poems reveal a catastrophic impact of such lust for power and control. So every time we read a poem from World War I which depicts the body of a soldier, so for example Futility by Wilfred Owen, at the back of our minds we're thinking, well, why has this happened? Why has this young innocent man been thrust into a war to die in such a pointless way? And in Futility, that's really the message of the poem. Owen describes a young man, a soldier who's fallen asleep and he's frozen to death, and his friends try to wake him up, but they can't. And so we're looking there at the impact of the big economic and political decisions on the lives of individual people who really have nothing to do with those political decisions. They're just pawns in a much bigger game. And that's one of the things that Owen asks us to reflect on in his poetry. War poems are also there to provide an interesting insight into the class dynamics of the period. So here it's worth asking yourself what the poet's socio-economic background was and how this may have impacted their experience of war. So, for example, someone like Wilfred Owen, who was upper middle class, relatively wealthy, he was an officer, would have had a different experience of war to a working class poet. So it'd be worth looking into what that poet's experience was and how it changes their presentation of war. Owen, for example, had a really strong sense of duty. That's the reason why after he was invalided out of the war, he was sent home to recover, and it was his sense of duty as an officer to his men that drove him back to the battlefield. He felt that he needed to protect his men and he had responsibility towards them. So his class And that feeling of responsibility that he derived from that class and that position in the army is quite an interesting aspect of his work. And I know that lots of people often talk about the First World War as being a great leveller. So, we see these images of the bodies lying in no man's land, and we think, well, officer, foot soldier, it doesn't matter. Death comes the same to everybody. But actually, what some war poems reveal is that coming face to face with death doesn't eradicate class divisions. Actually, if you think about it historically, if you were an officer, if you were upper class, and in the First World War, you would have received food packages from home, which would have sustained you, which would have improved your health. So when you went over the top of the trenches, you were in a healthier state than perhaps the working class foot soldier who hadn't received any food packages was. So think about maybe the hidden aspects of class, which are more deeply embedded in the poems. Let's look at the show itself then. I'm not going to read it to you, but I suggest that you Google it, have a read of it yourself, and then come back to this video in a minute. So at the start of the poem, the speaker's soul is with death, and death and the soul are looking down from the skies, and they have a bird's eye view of the battlefield. And this bird's eye view reveals a land beneath them, which is sad, it's scabbed like an old wound, it's full of horror. And the speaker can see thin caterpillars, the bodies of soldiers writhing on the battlefield, and these bodies are attempting to crawl back to safety. Overcome by the dreadfulness of the scene, the speaker seems to fall to earth, and death fell with him. And when they reach ground level, when they reach the battlefield, death shows the speaker the feet of dead bodies. He also shows him a fresh severed head, which the speaker realises is his own head. And the poem ends with this awful realization of the speaker's own death. He's had an out-of-body experience, and he's returned to realize that actually he has already perished in the battle. So structurally, of course, that's a really interesting device that you can think about. And if we're going a bit further into the speaker's perspective, thinking about the start of the poem where the speaker is up in the air and he's looking down, the speaker adopts the perspective of the airman, which was the World War I word for a pilot. So he's flying high above the carnage. And I need to try not to get carried away here, because part of my PhD thesis was on the representation of airmen in war literature. So anyway, we have this pilot, this airman flying high above everyone. And this creates a sense of distance from the horrific reality below. We would expect a sense of transcendence. And by transcendence, I mean rising above the mundanity, the monotony, the awful experiences as well of the battlefield. And it gives the individual a much greater understanding of the scale. So whilst on the one hand he's transcending and he's not directly experiencing these horrors, on the other hand, he can see mile after mile after mile of what is going on. And so it is an eye-opening experience, but also a really shocking experience as well for the speaker. And Owen reverses this traditional idea of freedom and transcendence, and he shows how the speaker's mind is unable to free itself from the sights that it has witnessed. So here, Owen may be reflecting on the psychological impact of trauma. Owen himself, when he was invalided out of the army, went to Craig Lockhart Hospital, which was a hospital for people suffering from shell shock. And it was there that he met the poet Siegfried Sassoon, and he took a lot of guidance from Sassoon in his writing. And I would suggest, if you're studying Owen, that you read a novel by Pat Barker, who lives in Durham actually, Pat Barker, and the novel's called Regeneration, and it's about Owen and Sassoon and their relationship and their experience of the war and the psychological impact the war had on individuals. And similarly, if we think about the opening phrase of this poem, my soul, it seems to promise an uplifting religious experience. Yet the poem presents us with the complete opposite. It's a haunting image of the darkness of the human soul. So we've gone from this kind of transcendent opening to this utter despair, looking at what individual humans can do to one another and what the economic and political machine of war can do to young men. As the speaker goes down into the battlefield then, what he experiences is the complete destruction of the natural world. So we see the battlefield being described using personification. So we have great pox and scabs, we have the beard of wire. So it's almost as if the natural world is a soldier in itself, and it has been injured and it is being destroyed by what's going on around it. And I suppose what we see here is that nature is another innocent victim of man's greed. And we also have another promise of transcendence in the moon, again undercut with the reminder of the hollow woe. And I just draw your attention to the musicality of these phrases. So we have these repeated O sounds, it's called assonance. So when the vowel sound is echoed across the different words, the moon, the hollow woe, they're very open sounds. And it's almost as if the language of the poem is opening like a gaping wound. And there's something really empty. It's almost an oxymoron, the idea of hollow woe. You know, you normally think of woe as being really bitter, as being intensely felt. But this is kind of hollowed out woe, as if people have experienced so much unhappiness that actually they don't even know how to feel emotions anymore. You know, as if their mind has been hollowed out and all that's left is this kind of dull throb of sadness rather than the intense pain that we associate with the word woe. As well as this, we have a semantic field of decay. So there's slime, there's a smell, there's the mire, and everything just seems to be collapsing around the speaker in the poem. Then if we look at the description of the other soldiers, it's really interesting because one of the things that Owen does is he negates the concept of war as being heroic. So in earlier war poems, a lot of earlier war poems, soldiers were courageous heroes and they lost their lives in loyal service to their country. So if you've read, for example, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson, it's a celebratory poem. The soldiers all die and it's a horrific defeat. However, Tennyson celebrates their huge courage, their patriotism, their loyalty to their country, the fact that they don't care what the outcome is going to be, but they're going to do their best for their own people. And if we look at a poem like this one that I've got on the screen here by Rupert Brooke, which is from 1914, we get the same kind of idea in the First World War. So Brooke says, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Now, these lines are really familiar to a lot of us, sometimes spoken on Remembrance Day. And what we see here is the veneration of the figure of the soldier and the fact that actually, if he dies, he's dying in the service of his country. He's dying for England, isn't he? So it's a really heroic picture. And this is reflected in a lot of the propaganda of the time as well. So some of the propaganda presented the war as like a game of rugby. You know, it's going to be all over by Christmas. We're going to have a good show, you know, all of this kind of masculine banter. And if you look at the title of the poem as well, The Show, you know, it's a pun, isn't it? Because it's a show because the speaker is being shown the impact of the war by death. But also it's a show because that is a word that people would have used at the time to describe war. And that word show, you know, it's like that phrase, good show, chaps. It really it's a euphemism, I suppose, for a battle. It really takes away the violence and the intensity of the battle and makes it seem like a very different kind of experience. And what Owen is trying to say is this is the real experience. It's not a good show. It's not a game of rugby. It's not something heroic. It's brutal. It's violent, it's traumatizing, and this is what your people are going through. So this is also linked into Owen's understanding of what the war was for. And I think sometimes people make the mistake that they think that Owen was a pacifist, and they think that his friend Siegfried Sassoon was a pacifist as well. And that's not entirely accurate. So Owen acknowledges soldiers' sacrifices, he acknowledges their courage, but at the same time, his poems resigned with the sense of frustration that these young men are losing their lives for little more than political and economic gain. And if we look here at what I've got on the screen, this is a quotation from Siegfried Sassoon's declaration. Now, Siegfried Sassoon, as I've mentioned earlier, was also a poet. He went to the war, and when he was there, he wrote this declaration which was calling on politicians to end the war. And in this declaration, he said, "I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which fighting men are being sacrificed." So what Sassoon is saying here is that these soldiers are being sent into a political war which is being deliberately extended for political and economic reasons, and that this isn't a decent enough reason for people to die. And Owen's poetry seems to align with Siegfried Sassoon's ideas about this a lot of the time. And so what we see in the show is that the soldiers are described as worms. So they've been pushed to the limit of human endurance and reduced to nothingness by the pressures they've been put under. And if you think about the people who would have been reading these poems back home, who would have read Siegfried Sassoon's declaration back home, the point that Owen and Sassoon are trying to get across is that this isn't fair. We need to stop this war and save these men and pull them out of the suffering that they're going through. So if you're studying World War I poetry, I think this brings up some questions that you would really want to ask yourself, whatever the poem is that you're looking at. What is the poet's attitude to the war, and why? Are they for the war, like Rupert Brooke was? Are they against the war? Does their attitude change? Are they against World War I, but not war in general? You might like to look at how the poet presents the experience of battle. So is it heroic and glorious, or is it futile and horrific, or is it somewhere in between? Similarly, how does the poet present the soldiers and their efforts? Again, are they heroic, celebrated, honoured, forgotten, insignificant, debased, or somewhere in amongst all of that spectrum? How does the poet present military and political leaders? Are they to be celebrated? Are they good leaders? Or does the poet express frustration at their betrayal of their men? And what is the poet's attitude towards gender, and why could be a really interesting question to look at. So how are male and female characters presented in the poems? Do characters of different genders experience the war in different ways? And does this impact their attitude to war? Could be a really interesting question as well to look at. Does the poet uphold stereotypes of gender? How does he do that? Why does he or she do that? And if you've been interested in what I'm talking about today, there's quite a lot of resources that you can go away and look at and do a little bit more research on. So I've put a list of names of key World War I poets that you might want to look at here. So Owen, that we've looked at today, Siegfried Sassoon. I've also put Isaac Rosenberg and Ivor Gurney, who are maybe lesser known poets of World War I, but incredibly interesting to look at. Vera Brittain and Jessie Pope I've put on here as female poets from World War I. Obviously they've got a very different perspective on what happened because they wouldn't have been on the front line. Vera Brittain was a nurse for a time. Jessie Pope is very famous for writing a poem called Who's for the Game, which was quite a jingoistic poem. So again, interesting to look at for different reasons. You could browse through the selection of poems on the Poetry by Heart website. The British Library, which is the second screenshot there, has great resources about World War I. And as well as that, there's a wonderful website called the First World War Poetry Digital Archive, curated by Oxford University, which is really useful as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you check out the other videos on this channel.